A new study in South Africa has found that BEE has destroyed 5 trillion rands and 4 million jobs in South Africa. This study compares South Africa's model to global models of affirmative action in the US, Malaysia, India, and Brazil. And the report says that affirmative action, or BEE in South Africa's form, has just brought destruction upon South Africa. The report went on to say that 1 trillion rand moved to only 100 people through various BEE contracts. Now, this report was produced by the Free Market Foundation and Solidarity. Now, no matter how you feel about these two organizations, they are not the only ones that are saying this. A few months ago, the World Bank came out and said that BEE in its current form is strangling growth in South Africa. No growth, no jobs. Let's say Mbeki, brother of former President Thabo Mbeki, has come out for years and he's been saying the same thing, that BEE contracts goes to connected individuals. And I think he produced some articles that said that there are 10,000 politically connected that are continuously getting government contract upon government contract due to BEE laws in South Africa.
BEE, which stands for Black Economic Empowerment, also known in other countries as affirmative action, is an initiative meant to streamline entry to the workforce for Indigenous Black South Africans. The intention clearly contextualizes the difference between racism and what BEE actually is. BEE's intention is not to exclude white people from the workforce. It's to remove obstacles that Black people have historically faced while trying to enter the workforce that they shouldn't have in a country where they make up the majority of the population and white people only make up 9%. Also, it's clear that not a lot of people know this about BEE, which is why I keep hearing this completely tired, parroted rhetoric, but BEE only applies to companies that have over, I think, something like 50 employees. And if you have a company in South Africa with over 50 employees and most of those employees are white in a country where white people only make up 9% of the country, that's fucking weird, my guy. And so I'm sure you would be fascinated to discover the meaning of racism because you clearly don't know what it is.
As we heard the other night, Black economic empowerment wasn't an ANC innovation, but rather the product of an apartheid-era business strategy. Because by the time democracy came, powerful white capital had already decided how to manage Black inclusion on their own terms. And it's not speculation, it's actually documented. I found a paper by Professor Grietjie Verhoef that gives us the receipts. And when I spoke about Moletti Mbeki and his first encounters with BEE, it had some credibility to it. And BEE policy didn't happen at a conference. His introduction to BEE happened in 1991 with a conversation with Steph Notling in FD de Klerk's Department of Trade and Industry. He then proceeded to explain to Mbeki that the project, where white-owned companies give shares to Black people, is aimed so that Black people wouldn't confuse apartheid for capitalism.
So, first you say BEE is racism and discrimination. Now, I'm immediately going to disagree with you on the fact that you say BEE is racism because BEE was implemented to address a previous structural and institutional oppression that caused great detriment to the economic stability of Black people in this country. What BEE is trying to do is not to bring down white people to put Black people in a position over them. It is trying to create equity and bring Black people up to the level of white people in terms of economic representation and economic capital and power within the country. Now, what you are right on is that BEE is discrimination. But lots of things are discrimination without necessarily being wrong or immoral or unfair discrimination.
If I can summarize his definition of Black economic empowerment, his definition was that he said that white companies must give shares to Black people so that the Black people do not mistake apartheid with capitalism, so that they get educated that apartheid is not the same thing as capitalism.
Okay, so the DA has proposed a bill that will scrap Black ownership as a factor to do business with government and essentially roll back broad-based Black economic empowerment. The party has introduced the Public Procurement Amendment Bill, which it says is a replacement for triple BEE, which the party says again has not worked. Okay, so let's go back a bit. BEE, or Black Economic Empowerment, was signed as an act and passed into law in 2003. Essentially, it was aimed at addressing the country's racial economic inequalities that were caused by apartheid. And how it wanted to do this was that government will give preferential treatment to companies that contributed to black empowerment, either through equity or enterprise and supplier development. At this point, I do have to mention that when I say black, in this context, it refers to black African people, colored, and Indian people. Now, over the years, BEE has been amended a number of times to improve it, strengthen its mechanisms, and that's why now it's known as BBBEE. So back to today. The DA held a media briefing in Bruma today saying that after more than 2 decades of BEE, it hasn't worked, it only benefits a few politically connected people, and it's time for a new empowerment policy. So it has proposed the Public Procurement Amendment Bill, which it will be tabling to Parliament soon.
In the 1990s, South Africa's economy was on the edge of great change. Apartheid was crumbling. White-owned corporations, especially the white mining giants, were slowly preparing for a new political reality. And on 13 May 1993, Sanlam, a major white-owned financial institution, made an announcement that would shift the economic landscape. It was going to sell 10% of its stake to Metropolitan Life, a life insurance company, to a black-led business consortium for the amount of 137 million rand. At the time, that was a hell of a lot of money. It was a first major step in what would later be called Black Economic Empowerment, or BEE. And the buyer was Methold, a new black-owned investment group led by Ntato Mklana. Mklana wasn't just a businessman, he was a Sowetan doctor, a community leader, and Nelson Mandela's family physician. And behind the scenes, the deal was made possible by the state-backed lender, this name might ring a bell, the IDC, the Industrial Development Corporation. 3 months later, Methold rebranded. The company became New Africa Investments Limited, or NAIL, as I mentioned in my previous video, and it became the first black-owned company listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And with that, BEE era had officially begun.
I'm not going to tell you that BEE is always perfectly implemented in this country, because it isn't, but the concept is sound. The problem with our economy is that work opportunities are scarce for everyone. But unfortunately, while black people have been facing this problem for decades, white people are now suddenly coming into this realization and deciding that it has something to do with racism against them when it's not. Welcome to the world. Hello? And of course, there have been incidences in which 2 people have applied for a job. One is black and one is white, and they both have the same qualifications. So race has been the deciding factor. The black person gets the job. Do I think that's racism? No. In fact, I think that's an exercise of good deontological ethics, because what has often been the case historically is the exact opposite outcome. So if you think that's racism, then maybe the reason you can't find a job isn't because you're white, but because of your inability to think critically.
Professor William Gomede of the Wits School of Government has come out and said that BEE in its current form has led to unemployment, poverty, and is increasing the inequality gap in South Africa. Now, as a South African, living in South Africa and experiencing BEE, however you experience it, despite your background, you don't need a report to tell you the realities that you live. Let me know in the comments below how BEE has affected you. Has it been good? Has it been bad? Can the country carry on and sustain the BEE model that it currently has? Is there a better alternative? For me, we've seen about more than 20 years of hardcore BEE in whatever form it has come in South Africa. And all we're seeing is more unemployment, greater gaps between the rich and the poor, and that gaps are going to continue. So where do we go to as a nation? Now, the president has opened up national dialogue. National dialogue is on this platform. If the government wants to hear it, people are voicing their opinion all the time. When is action going to be taken?
So let's look at it a bit. Firstly, as I said at the start, the DA's proposals removes race as an empowerment factor and replaces it with what it calls an outcome-driven system. So instead of companies being required to have certain percentage of black ownership, the DA's bill will determine empowerment based on the company's contribution to things like poverty alleviation, job creation, and environmental sustainability, among other factors.
And that leads me to your second thing that you say. It goes against the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Fact. No, it does not. Because what the Constitution says is the state may not unfairly discriminate, directly or indirectly, against anyone on one or more grounds, including race, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, etc., etc. Now, did you catch the wording there? It didn't say discrimination. It didn't say discriminate. It said unfairly discriminate. And that is very, very important. Because the Constitution says discrimination on one or more of the grounds listed in subsection 3 is unfair unless it is established that the discrimination is fair. So the Constitution has made the provision for discrimination to be legal on certain grounds as long as that discrimination is fair and not unfair. Now, BEE has been determined to be fair discrimination. Why? Because, like I said before, it's trying to correct a pre-existing imbalance in economic power and wealth distribution within the country. And this could change at some point.
So now the DA is also proposing a new BEE scorecard. So the current BEE scorecard has 5 elements which companies get rated on. The first one is ownership, which essentially looks at how many shares of the company are held by black people. Number 2 is management control. This deals with how many black people are in senior positions at that said company. And number 3 is skills development, the money that the company spends on upskilling its black employees. Now number 4 is enterprise and supply development. This carries the most points in the BEE scorecard as it deals with how much services and goods a company is procuring from black-owned companies. Now this element is why you see a lot of big companies having to subcontract their government tenders to smaller companies. Now the last element, which carries about 5 points, is the company's overall corporate social initiatives. So the DA is proposing that it wants to replace the 5-element scorecard with just 2 criteria for economic inclusion and empowerment. The first one being how much value for money a company can produce, giving this a weighting of 80%. And then the second one is the company's economic inclusion impact, which weighs 20% on the DA's proposed scorecard. The DA also proposes a disqualification criteria. This is for companies that have a proven track record of fraud and corruption. So the DA says there will be a way to measure the company's social development goals in terms of how many feeding schemes the company contributes to, early childhood development centers, the hiring of local people, small business support, and renewable energy projects, etc.
But then came 1985, Rubicon speech, international sanctions, and a collapse in the rand. Business confidence was gone. And these white-owned companies, they realized that their survival depended on only one thing: peaceful transition to black political rule without the destruction of their financial empires. So they began planning. And Verhoef shows us how, from 1985 onwards, Sanlam made a strategic pivot. They realized that if Afrikaner capital wanted to survive the transition, they had to transform from an ethnic nationalist project to a race-neutral capitalist one. And that meant building black economic elites. Not just any elites, managerial elites. Individuals who would own stakes in white corporations without threatening how those corporations were fundamentally run. They aimed at stabilizing markets and managing risks.
Like, we might start to consider BEE to be unfair discrimination when, say, for example, white people are disproportionately unemployed in the country, or when white people are underrepresented in company ownership or management positions in the country, or maybe when white people are underrepresented in terms of the amount of wealth that they hold in the country. However, at the moment in the country, the opposite is true. It's black people who are disproportionately unemployed in this country. It is black people who are underrepresented in company ownership and in management positions. And it is white people who still control a disproportionate amount of wealth in this country. So until that has equalized, until we are no longer facing the consequences of the systematic discrimination of apartheid, BEE will continue to be seen as fair discrimination. So if you don't want BEE, you better be making a concerted effort to change that representation in our country.
Sanlam and Suncorp began quietly recruiting black professionals, accountants, lawyers, business people, bringing them into investment vehicles that were fully designed and controlled by Sanlam. In 1993, before the ANC was even in power, Sanlam launched New Africa Investment Limited, or NAIL, with the goal of becoming the premier black-owned investment company. And who helped finance it? Sanlam. Who structured the deals? Sanlam. Who picked the leadership? Sanlam. So Professor Verwoerd makes something very clear to us, that Sanlam's early empowerment strategy was not a moral project. It was about continuity of control. They needed black shareholders to prevent populist backlash, but they didn't want to give up managerial power or control over capital allocations. So they designed BEE to be about ownership, not operational power. And here's the model. Take a white-owned asset, carve out a minority stake, finance it through debt, vendor funding, or preferred shares, and then place the stake in the hands of a politically connected black individual or consortium. Let them repay debts using dividends from the same company. And this structure ensured that black partners had skin in the game, but very little control. It also kept them financially dependent on the success of white-run corporations. It was empowerment on a leash. And yes, this model became the basis for post-1994 BEE deals across the country. By the time the ANC came into power in 1994, Sanlam and Suncorp had already prototyped BEE for nearly a decade. In fact, many of the early post-apartheid BEE pioneers were alumni of the Sanlam network. Verhoef even points out that these companies framed BEE as a joint nation-building project.
If you are driving along the N1 highway in Johannesburg near Bromhof, you are likely going to see this newly unveiled DA billboard which reads, BEE made ANC elites rich and left South Africa poor. Basically, the party is criticizing the broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Act's policy,
masking what eventually formed an elite co-option. The ANC, grappling with economic uncertainty and budget deficits, saw these models as workable solutions for fast-tracking black ownership in the economy without direct state redistribution. So what Mbeki described in his anecdote earlier wasn't just a casual proposal from a bureaucrat. It was the culmination of nearly a decade of strategic planning by one of apartheid's most powerful economic engines. BEE wasn't invented in Luthuli House. It was licensed to them by white capital, ready to roll out. So then what does this actually mean? The very companies that profited under apartheid also engineered the terms of black inclusion after apartheid. Professor Verhoef's work shows us that BEE wasn't just a radical break from apartheid's capitalism. It was more like a continuation, a new game but with different referees.